What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and just in time for the Eternals film, it looks like Marvel is basically reworking the history of the Eternals, really with modifications to their existing origins, as well as how their origin ties into Thanos, which makes sense because, in all honesty, the Eternals have not really been relevant or interesting in Marvel Comics, probably since like the mid-2000s, right? When you had like the Eternals run that tied in with what was going on with the X-Men, and like the return of the Dreaming Celestial and all that kind of stuff. Outside of that, they weren't relevant before that until like Heroes Reborn, and maybe like the 80s before that. But they've only had like 5-year points, right? 5-year windows where they mattered, and then they would just disappear into obscurity forever and nobody would really care anything about them. So here's the thing, this is what's kind of crazy about this. One of the things that Kieran Gillen's been doing here has been focusing on the idea of expanding on the mythos, but also basically giving us this idea that there was a kind of schism that took place among the Eternals. Now, this was not something that we were readily familiar with. In fact, it's not really something Marvel's ever really explored at all. The way the normal timeline of the Eternals played out is that they were created by the Celestials a million years ago, that they were supposed to basically safeguard humanity from the Deviants. The Eternals basically deviated from that, partly because they didn't care, and partly because there was a civil war that broke out between Uranos and Kronos, where basically Uranos wanted to conquer Earth and Kronos wanted to be peaceful. And so ultimately Uranos lost, they were cast into space, they took up residence on Saturn's moon Titan, where they fell into another civil war, and then all but Sui-San were destroyed. We'll talk about why she matters here in a minute. But in terms of being on Earth, that the Eternals could never really reproduce in the same way that humanity or even the Deviants could. And so because they were being outnumbered by the Deviants, and because the Deviants had enslaved humanity, they called the Celestials back. The Celestials basically initiated the Great Cataclysm, right? So the sinking of Atlantis, when the Deviants attacked the Celestials, and then the Celestials warned the Eternals, if you deviate from your role again, doing whatever you have to do, right? Because you literally have the power to use cosmic energy, your job is to make sure the Deviants don't run awry. If you deviate from this again, we will destroy you all. And so following that, the Eternals basically maintain their role of kind of shepherding humanity, safeguarding humanity from the Deviants from that point going forward, until such a time as like people with power started popping up, right? The X-Men, Blue Marvel, the Sentry, Incredible Hulk, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, all these guys, and humanity could basically protect itself. And so this schism is introduced based on the premise of the fact that Eternals didn't really have the ability to reproduce. And that's where this new civil war takes place. That on one side, you have Alars, and you have Ikaris, and you have all these Eternals that are siding with him over the desire or the idea that Eternals should be able to procreate in the traditional sense, right? Like, you guys know how this whole process works, right? That when a mom and a dad really want to have a baby, they call the stork, and the stork brings the baby, and then they raise the child as their own. You guys know how the reproductive process works. And so because of this, it's one of these things where this war has really split the Eternal community on ideological lines. That on one side, Ikaris believes they should be able to procreate. On the other side, it's not really working that way. That you have Zuras, who is really the leader of the Eternals on Earth at the moment, who believes that the Eternals' role was prescribed for them by the Celestials and by the Great Machine, right? Now, the Great Machine, again, we talked about that during the beginnings of Kieran Gillen's Eternals run, that the Great Machine is basically what keeps the Celestials alive, right? It's how they resurrect whenever they die. And if the Great Machine were to somehow break down, malfunction, be destroyed, it would destroy the Earth in the process. It seems more like a failsafe device, assuming that would even actually happen. Thus, the Eternals believe it because that's what they were told, but we've never actually seen an instance where the machine failed and Earth was destroyed with it, because it's a new thing, right? It's never really been pushed to that point before. And so because of this, it kind of creates a cool situation, right? It's like, what happens if you don't press the red button? And then suddenly when you stop pressing it, who knows what takes place, right? Is everything going to end, or will things just continue on? Because it was really more of an experiment to see, will you just do what you're told? And so this kind of civil war here is ultimately brought to an end by what is basically, Thena, right? The mother, or at least the wife of Kronos, and the mother of Zuras and Alars, right? Now, here's one thing to understand when it comes to Eternals. Because of the fact that they can't really procreate in the traditional sense, they were all basically made at the exact same time. The term mother, father, those are loose-knit terms. Those are terms to design or to define the roles within the Eternal family, right? So if you think back to like the early days of humanity, you had kings and queens. Imagine instead of calling that person a king, you would call them father. And instead of calling her a queen, you would call her mother, right? So it's just really a hierarchy among the Eternal race. But the idea is that they still have a kind of authority there that's recognized by everybody else. And so as they're allowed to air their grievances, Zuras and Alars anyway, and as they're allowed to discuss and kind of have this great big huge debate on what it is that should be allowed to happen, the response of Thena is, okay, so here's what's going to happen. One, Alars, you're going to lose this war, and the damage you do to the Great Machine will be catastrophic, all the way to the point that you you might even destroy the entirety of humanity. You do not have the numbers and you cannot complete your research while this war continues. And then she says, you Zuras, you will win given time, but many defiant Eternals will end up being excluded, right? And we'll talk about what exclusion means at the end of this because it's something that they've referenced, but we've never actually seen before. And so she says, you say you want to protect the machine, but all exclusions hurt it. And so in effect, Alars cannot conduct his experiment without basically dooming the world. And Zuras cannot oppose the experiment of Alars without basically reducing the Eternal population down to almost zero, which in turn would allow the Deviants to rise again, the Celestials would show back up, and they would basically destroy what's left of the Eternals. They would probably kill the Deviants too, and then wipe the slate clean on Earth and just start all over again. And so ultimately Dana says, here's what's going to happen. Because of the nature of this, and because of the fact that neither side can really win without some kind of catastrophic loss, you Alars, you'll be sent away from Earth to a place where you can conduct your experiments, you can do your thing, and you Zuras will stay here and you'll guard the great machine and you'll keep things as part of the status quo, right? You'll keep things the way that they've basically always been. And so in doing that, all these Eternals that have been engaged in war with one another, if they've died, they're resurrected, and if they're alive, their minds are wiped. But basically, it's all started all over again, right? And this is the normal process when it comes to the Eternals. It's still a kind of relatively new thing, but it's the process with Eternals. If you are an Eternal and you die, you get resurrected. Now, sometimes your mind is completely wiped, and sometimes it's not. It depends on the circumstance under which you died. But the important thing here is that Alars is basically, like, he ends up taking off, right? He's basically allowed to leave. And when the question is asked of him by Zuras, where are you going to go? His response is, I'm going to go where there's the last Eternal left, right? At least the last Eternal that's not on Earth. I'm going to go to Saturn's moon Titan, and I'm going to meet with this Eternal, and then hopefully we can find some way to reproduce. And that's when he meets Sui-San. Now again, Sui-San was the last survivor of the civil war among the Eternals that had left Earth, that had followed Uranos, and then basically destroyed themselves in a civil war. Now the reason why they fell into a civil war was weird. It was like the dragon of the moon, and it was this crazy thing. There's a reason why Kieran Gillen doesn't really acknowledge that here. He just says like a conflict broke out and they all died, because even then the whole idea of the dragon of the moon was kind of silly. It was a little nonsensical. But the important thing is that when he arrives here, one of the things to know is that Sui-San, despite how she'd been depicted in years past in Marvel, was always kind of battle hardened. You always sort of expected that, right? That at the end of the day, she is an Eternal, right? So her power here, the ability to manipulate cosmic energies, super high level capabilities, right? Super strength, speed, durability, all that kind of stuff. She's way beyond your normal human. Despite the fact that they look human and they act human, they're way beyond what humans are normally capable of. But they're very human in terms of how they work, because at their base, they are humans, right? And so following that, as soon as Mentor arrives here, or really Alars changing his name to Mentor, when he arrives here, he starts talking to Sui-San. And the whole thing about this is that as they discuss this, he talks about how the civil war that broke out here, the fact that she's the last survivor left, like any great thing in this universe, that she's basically been reduced down to her strongest foundations so you can basically rebuild. It is in some ways manipulation, and she picks up on that, right? It's like the game, right? It's like the dating game, right? It's kind of how this works. I mean, whatever your fancy is, if you're looking for something long-term or something short-term, it's a dance, right? There really is no difference between the human, mating process and like birds in the Amazon. There's no difference there, right? It's just how it is we go about this dance. And so Sui-San is ultimately kind of like, all right, let's see where this goes, right? And so ultimately the biggest issue that you have here is that while Alars and Sui-San are able to like clone Eternals, they're able to genetically engineer and create Eternals, they cannot actually reproduce an Eternal. They cannot produce a child of their own through conventional means, laying down with each other, doing the damn thing, and popping out a kid 9 months later. They can't do it, right? It just doesn't work for them. And so what you actually end up seeing here is the arrival of Kronos, right? Of course, kind of the father of the Eternals, and in fact, one guy who had basically achieved a level of godhood, right? Kronos is essentially a cosmic entity. You only ever really see him involved with the Eternals themselves, but he still is an astronomically powerful being. And so one of the things that happens is that Alars approaches him and says like, we need your help in procreating. And he tells him it's a mistake. What you're trying to do here is not the way you were designed. It's not what it's for. You have to trust that the Celestials knew what they were doing. But at the end of the day, the response of Alars is, I don't care, right? Our desire is like my desire, a part of this experiment is to see, can we procreate? The fact that the Earth was almost completely conquered by the Deviants because they could procreate and we couldn't, which inherently reduced our numbers, presented a credible threat. We need to know if we can actually do this. You are a being of cosmic power. You have the ability to remove the blocks that exist in our genealogy that would allow us to procreate. please, will you do this? And so the response of Kronos is yes, but I will not have a grandson out of wedlock, right? Like, you need to get married and go through the whole process. And he says, I'll even provide the rings. What's crazy about this is the rings he gives to Alars and Sui-San are the quantum bands, which is crazy. Now, the reason why this is crazy is because in years past in Marvel Comics, specifically if you go back and you read Jim Starlin's old Captain Marvel run in issues 28 and 29 from 1973, one of the things this did is it dealt with like the history of like the Eternals and, you know, them on Titan and Thanos and all that kind of stuff, right? That was back when Thanos was getting the cosmic cube and trying to destroy everything. But the other part of this is you never saw this particular reference because this is a new introduction. The quantum bands historically have been given to individuals by the cosmic entity Eon, who you actually see here, that tree looking thing. They've been given to individuals for the purpose of allowing them to be protectors of the universe. And the quantum bands themselves actually derive energy from the quantum realm. And in Marvel Comics, the explanation of the quantum realm is simply that all energy that makes up the entirety of the Marvel universe is based in the quantum realm, right? It comes from the quantum realm. So while the rings themselves can only hold a finite amount of energy, the amount of energy that can be put into the rings is infinite, right? So it's like a cup that can only hold so much water, but the water that you're putting into that cup is limitless, right? So that's how this kind of thing works. And so because of that, it's interesting to see here. Now, the quantum bands as they're provided here seem to be more ceremonial than anything else, but it's still kind of a cool little reference to see with regards to the history of the quantum band's use in the Marvel universe. But one of the things that Kronos also says is that given his knowledge of time and all things in existence, that basically they're going to end up having a boy. And so that's kind of the crazy thing, is because they end up basically finding out that they're essentially going to have like 2 sons. And the first one they're going to name Eros, who they're going to name for their love. And the second one they're going to call Thanos, which is their triumph over death. And so it's kind of a cool thing here, right? It's an interesting concept to see how it is that it came that way. Now, of course, one of the things is told to us, and we're kind of given this quick little ramshackle explanation with regards to Sui-San, and we can fill in the gaps here, is that of course, nothing really went the way that it was supposed to. That Alars had seen the idea of Eternals being able to procreate as ushering in what was in effect a new era, kind of a golden age. With Eros, yeah, that was the case. I mean, he was kind of a dick, and he would use his power to emit pheromones to basically manipulate people, but all in all, Eros was largely harmless. He was really more interesting and more entertaining than anything else, especially when he operated as a superhero Starfox. With Thanos, as you guys know, that was not the case. And as soon as Sui-San gave birth to Thanos, she realized how horrible and how evil Thanos was going to become, and actually tried to kill him. Of course, that led to her being thrown into what was basically an insane asylum on Titan itself. And then of course, Thanos eventually caught up to her when he was being manipulated by Mistress Death as a little kid, and then ultimately killed Sui-San. And that in turn basically gave rise to him eventually showing back up on Titan after having amassed a colossal army, and then raising Titan in its entirety and basically killing everybody there, which is really, really cool because for what I want to do here for a second, I want to tie this into the MCU, right? Let's talk about the Marvel Cinematic Universe for a second and how this would work. Here's one of the cool things to know. Thanos gave us a great big huge explanation on the history of Titan and why he's doing what he's doing. Who's to say he was telling the truth, right? I mean, Thanos is largely considered to be the sin of Titan. Now, I will say that one of the best statements made in the Marvel Cinematic Universe by Nebula is that one of the things Thanos is not is a liar. And even in Marvel Comics, it's not really that way, largely because Thanos has no reason to lie, right? Lying is something people do when they're afraid of the consequences for what it is that they've done. But when has Thanos ever been afraid of the consequences for what he's done? If anything, he cherishes the idea of what he does, right? Like blinking out half the life in the universe, in his mind, he did it for love. Why would you be fearful of that? And why would you have to lie about it? So, taking those two things and kind of merging them together, you can largely go with the idea that Thanos may have on some level been telling the truth. But I wouldn't be surprised that because of the recent Eternals run, constantly referring to Thanos as the sin of Titan, the mistake of Titan, different things like that, the likelihood that he may have in some form or fashion been kind of manipulated by Mistress Death or just driven by his obsession with death, which was really teased at like the post-credit scene of the first Avengers movie, that may come to fruition in the MCU. I'm sort of curious to see how that's going to play out. The important thing here is that because of what had happened, because of the fact that basically Alars takes it upon himself as a personal guilt in the sense that he and Sui-San gave birth to Thanos, who is basically the harbinger of death in the universe, that there was really no undoing this. And seeing it as a great personal mistake and error, he actually tries to give the rings back to Kronos, which is really more more of an act of defiance or opposition, more so than anything else. But ultimately, as we know, Thanos catches up to Mentor, catches up to his father, and then kills him. And so what ends up happening is that as soon as that happens, he's resurrected in the exclusion zone. Now, this is something that we'd never seen before, right? This is totally new, completely undocumented stuff, right? This is the first time we're seeing this in the history of Marvel Comics. He's basically brought back by Ikaris and all those guys, really the Great Machine more than anything else. And the question is, how did the experiment go, right? Like, can you report the result of the experiment that you engaged in? And he's like, Eternals should not breed. And in truth, the response is, you are to be excluded, right? And the reason why he's being excluded here is not so much the fact that he chose to try to find a way to get Eternals to procreate. It's because of the nature of Alars, that no matter what they do, no matter how many times they mind wipe him, it seems to be in his nature to basically deviate away from the status quo. And so if the Eternals were, for example, to find some way to actually destroy Thanos, and they were to essentially mind wipe Alars and allow him to be reborn without any knowledge of his past mistakes, he would likely create another Thanos. And even if he was allowed to live and Thanos was seemingly left alive, and that even if his mind was wiped, that he could potentially create a new Thanos, right? That it's in his nature to experiment. It's in his nature to break away from the status quo. He presents more of a danger than he does a benefit. And so when the question's asked, when he's taken to his exclusion cell, and the question's asked, where's Sui-San? Is she still alive? Like, was she, brought back by the machine just like me? The response of Ikaris is yes, but she does not want to see you. She's in her cell just like you are. And she said it would be better if we had never met. More so, it would be better if we had never existed. And so what ends up happening inside this cell is basically a person seems to be met with their own personal torment, their own personal failure. In this instance, the cell itself is completely dark, but the penalty that Alars is paying in this cell is that a pixel is going to show up, right? A pixel is going to appear, and each one of these pixels represents a person that Thanos has killed. And so basically, he's going to live here in this exclusion cell so long as Earth exists. Until the time that Earth is destroyed, he will stay here. And seemingly, when Earth is destroyed, he'll die along with it. This is basically a prison he's going to be in for the rest of his life, or until such a time the decision is made to release him. That's likely not going to happen. But in everything he's seen, because of how many people Thanos has killed, he's ultimately surrounded by just this bright burning light, which burns his eyes out of his head, and he's basically just left there, right? This is his fate, is to just stay there and suffer inside this cell, seemingly for all eternity. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Honestly, this story was amazing. I loved this. I love stories like this where they go back and tell like the history of things. I love those kinds of stories in Marvel Comics. I've always loved history itself, so this is really fascinating to me. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section, and I will catch you all later. Peace.